again. Yes, I'm very happy to pick up. So hi, my name is Richard Smith. I'm the head of TEF. Really pleased to be talking to you all today about our TEF proposals. I'm not precisely sure what introductory remarks Graham was going to say, but I think he was just reflect on the fact that we've been through a period of pulling together a number of proposals around the TEF, and that's building on what we've learned from the independent review, building on work we've been doing around quality and standards, consultations, and we're very pleased to have our opportunity to talk to you about those proposals today. So today you have the opportunity to ask a number of questions. We'll try and put as much time into that as possible. We're going to cover the purpose of the TEF. We're going to cover a number of the proposals too. We'll talk about the framework, we'll talk about the scope, we'll talk about evidence, and we'll talk about assessment outcomes and implementation. And I think we're running to about 3:15. Could we move on to the next slide? Okay, so there's just a few event notices to run through. Closed captions are available, so at the bottom of the screen you should be able to click on the CC icon. We're going to be recording this session, and as well as the recording, the slides will be available on the OFS website afterwards. Now, the way we want to run today's session is that we're asking members of the audience to use the Q&A box. So don't use the chat box to ask a question, use the Q&A box. You can ask questions at any time, and we'll answer them at a number of set points during the presentation. What you can use the chat box for is if you'd like to speak to the events team. So if you're having any issues, then do let us know and we'll try and deal with them. Okay. Other thing I wanted to say, we've got some other events. So we ran an event last week, in fact, which was more an event for colleagues who aren't as familiar with the TEF. So this event today is an event for people that are more familiar with the TEF and how it's worked in the past. Tomorrow, we're having an event looking at our consultation on our approach to regulating student outcomes. And next week, there's an event looking at our consultation on constructing student outcome and experience indicators for use in OFS Regulation 2. And we've got various dates that we're running TEF student workshops too. So do have a look at our website and do let student representatives in your universities and colleges know about them. It'd be really great to see a good representation at those TEF student workshops too. Okay, next slide. Okay, so moving into what was going to be my part of the session. As I say, it's great to see that we've got a really good turnout today. Really interested to hear the kind of comments that people are going to make, the observations, questions people will be asking. As I mentioned, today's session is for people that are more familiar with the TEF. So we're not going to go into all of the background and history around the TEF. If you are interested in any of that, you could watch last week's recording, or alternatively, you can have a look on our web pages. There are a few kind of introductory comments I wanted to make. The first is some of this will be familiar to if you've been involved in the TEF, but also back in July of this year, we did put out a publication that trailed a number of the high-level proposals that we were working on around the TEF, and you'll see how those translate into the proposals that I'm going to talk to you about today. The other point that I wanted to make is that our proposals very much build on the learning we've gained from delivering the TEF in the past, the learning we've gained from delivering the subject pilots over the last few years. Of course, there's the independent review, which Graham was talking about, which was really well-received set of recommendations that Shirley Pearce put together. And of course, the government responded to that back in January as well. So we've taken that into consideration too. So you'll see how we've sought to balance all of that through our proposals. And you'll see a number of places, of course, that we've very much looked to build on the recommendations of the independent review. In some places, you'll see, of course, they are different. And I wanted to make that point at the start. We've been very much thinking about how we ought to articulate TEF as a coherent and complementary part of our wider quality and standards regulation. And that's very much why we've sought to publish our TEF consultation at the same time as our consultation on student outcomes, and how the data that underpins both of those functions can be made more uniform across those functions. So I do hope that you had a chance to look not only at the TEF consultation, but to have a chance at how it sits in that kind of wider context. So moving on to this first slide, really, sorry, just back 2 slides, please. Purpose slide. Thank you. Yeah, so just to talk a bit more about the purpose of the TEF, and this is really important because, of course, all our proposals flow from how we see the TEF working and what we see its purpose to be. And a couple of points I wanted to make just on this first slide. First, relatively straightforward, we see the TEF as one of our levers to incentivize excellence in teaching and learning and student outcomes. We see it as a national exercise working across universities and colleges across the nations, and we see it as kind of incentivizing universities and colleges. We also see it as a mechanism that will operate above what we call the minimum baseline quality requirements, and hopefully you'll all be familiar with the way that the OFS regulates at baseline and how we're proposing to do that in future. Now, it's important to kind of understand that we see the TEF operating above the baseline, because that does very much flow through our proposals as we go through. The second thing to say about the TEF and what we see its purpose as is that we very much want it to be a tool that incentivizes improvement for providers for their mix of students and courses. So there's a number of points to make here. We think that this is really important because it means that TEF takes into account the context the provider operates in, and that this approach will really mean that TEF will benefit the widest range of students possible. And hopefully, as you see, as I go through the proposals, we've sought to design them in such a way that they do work for a broad range of provider types and a broad range of different types of provider mission. So put another way, very much we see the TEF as an opportunity for all types of higher education provider to demonstrate the fact that they can be excellent in their own context and that they can do fantastic jobs for their students. It's not simply about being the best overall. The other point to make about this point around mix of students and courses is how it links to our wider kind of regulatory ambitions around equality of opportunity, which is very much at the heart of the work that we do here at the OFS alongside protecting and promoting quality. So the way we've designed the TEF means that providers will have to show excellence across all of their groups of students. And if they don't do that, then they won't necessarily be recognised with the most prestigious outcomes. Last point to make here is that we see that the TEF ratings that will be produced as a result of this exercise would create an incentive effect. So we want to put a spotlight on the quality of providers' courses. We want to influence providers through their reputations, and we do want this all to influence and inform student choice. So with that being said, I'll move now onto the actual proposals. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through a set of proposals at a time, and then we'll take some questions. So the first set of proposals I want to talk about are around the framework. So this is very much how we see the way the TEF is designed. So the first proposal is around provider level periodic ratings. Second proposal is around aspects and features of assessment. And the third and fourth proposals are around how we're structuring the outcomes of the TEF. So just to say a little bit more about those in turn, provider level TEF, obviously I'm sure many of you will be aware that the original TEF, when it was introduced, was provider level, but there was an intention of moving to subject level over time. We've been exploring that through pilot exercises. However, the conclusion of both the pilot exercises and the independent review was that we would be well served with a provider level exercise. And so our proposal is that the exercise will lead to a single rating for the provider overall. It wouldn't lead to separate ratings for different subjects. However, a really important point I want to make here is that we do think that information around subjects and groups of students is very important for the overall assessment of a provider. We want to see that the TEF has traction within universities, and colleges, within departments, has traction with the people that are teaching students, not just university administration and senior staff. And so we think that having an exercise that incorporates consideration of subjects and groups of students is very, very important. The other thing about our first proposal is that we see the TEF operating on a 4-yearly basis. We think that this is the best way to balance overall the policy intention that we want with TEF and the amount of work that it would involve. So we don't want to have a TEF that runs every year. We think that 4 years is the best way of balancing that. So the second proposal is around aspects and features of assessment. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Hopefully aspects are relatively familiar to colleagues here because it is a feature that we had in the TEF previously. But what we're essentially saying is, what is the TEF interested in assessing? And this slide here illustrates how we're interested in assessing 2 broad areas in the TEF: student experience and student outcomes. And what you can see from this diagram is that where we've sought to articulate student experience and student outcomes as being our areas of interest, we've done that by building on top of the baseline proposed quality and standards conditions. And so again, just going back to the purpose, this is one of the ways in which we see the TEF operating above the baseline. So in terms of the student experience, we're interested in, for example, the extent to which teaching, learning and assessment and the educational environment at university or college delivers excellent academic experience for students. In terms of student outcomes, we're interested in how far students succeed in and beyond their studies, but also their educational gains. And I wanted to bring out educational gains as a specific point here. So in terms of wider student outcomes, we will be looking at data, and I'll talk a bit more about the indicators. We'll be looking at continuation, completion, and progression. But we do think it's really important that providers are able to articulate the kind of gains students could achieve beyond these quantitative outcomes. Now, educational gains was something that the independent review suggested as being included in the framework. And the way we see this working is that we recognize that there is a diversity of mission, diversity of types of approaches in the sector. So we very much want to see providers articulating the types of additional educational gains that could be achieved by their students through submissions. If you have a look at our consultation, you'll see that there's an annex within it that sets out a lot more information about what student experience and student outcomes covers in a bit more detail. We describe what we call features of excellence, which kind of unpack the student experience and student outcomes underneath. And you can see how we try and also differentiate between different levels of excellence for different types of feature within that. So do have a look at the consultation annexes as well if you haven't. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So proposals 3 and 4 are around the rating categories and also a 4th rating as well. So we're proposing to continue with the previous rating names of bronze, silver and gold. We're proposing to introduce a 4th category, which we're calling requires improvement. And we're also proposing that as well as the overall rating that we would award a provider, we would also rate those 2 aspects that I just described. So you would get a rating for the student experience and student outcomes performance too. So in terms of the bronze, silver and gold names, the independent review did discuss alternatives. Now, we've looked at that quite carefully, and we think that bronze, silver and gold will have a strong incentive effect on providers and hence deliver the purpose that we're seeking to achieve. We also think that bronze, silver and gold are understandable by students, and whilst we're not putting the same kind of weight on student information as the previous TEF did in terms of its purpose, we do think that student information is important and that having ratings that are understandable to students will be valuable. But we are interested in views on these names, and we're going to undertake some polling with student groups as well to also inform the consultation outcomes. So one of the features that is new to this iteration of TEF is this 4th category, requires improvement. And we did trail the idea that we would have a fourth category, and an expansion of the number of categories was something that was suggested by the independent review too. So what we're trying to do here is really establish that incentive effect to make clear that bronze is excellent, to make clear that bronze, silver, and gold are differential outcomes that are excellent above the baseline. In the past, when we had bronze being the lowest award, there were concerns around this, and this requires improvement category does seek to address that concern. So requires improvement outcome could be the outcome when a panel identifies, for example, that there's no or minimal excellent features of the provider, or it identifies areas of provision that are below very high quality or that may be of concern, and that it judges that these are sufficiently serious and widespread to prevent the award of a bronze or higher. Okay, so I'll say a little bit more about eligibility in the next section, but this slide also illustrates that the outcome of requires improvement through the TEF process is separate to our regulatory decisions about whether there's been a breach of the baseline. Now, as we indicated through our quality and standards consultations previously, we do propose that this lowest TEF outcome would be something that we look at as part of our general monitoring as well. So I think I've run through those quite quickly, but we wanted to leave time for questions. So I think I'll hand back over to Graham if he's managed to fix his microphone and see what people want to ask.
Thanks, Rich. I have rebooted my Wi-Fi and switched headsets. Hopefully I sound okay now. Rich, could you give me a nod or a thumbs up?
It is definitely better, yeah. Okay,
well, hopefully that's better. Just comment in the chat if you still can't hear very well. I hopefully sound human and not like a robot anymore. So we've had quite a number of questions. Thanks for those. I'm going to leave some of them until they come up later in Richard's presentation, but for now, a few questions about the timing of the 4-year cycle and how that relates to the proposals we're making about access and participation plans. So also on a 4-year cycle, are they going to clash? Are they going to be sequenced?
Okay, so yeah, I thought we might get some questions about access and participation. I'm sure colleagues here will have watched John's, or may have had the opportunity to watch John's presentation yesterday. So I do have a slide around the timetable later, but we're proposing the TEF timetable will be that, subject to the outcomes of this consultation, we'll open up a submission window for providers September through to November. And then we would run the assessments and seek to have outcomes in early May through early 2023. So my understanding of the access and participation timeline is that there will be guidance on variations coming out in April. Those variations will come in July this year, and then the OFS will make decisions around them. And then it will be for 24-25 in the following year that the OFS will produce guidance and ask for the 4-year plans at that point. So I think what we'll see is that if we run the 4-year processes, TEF will run, then we'll have a break, then you'll have the access and participation plans being renewed. So they'll kind of run, they'll leapfrog each other effectively. So hopefully that will be, I mean, we'll be interested in views on how well that works, but hopefully that will reduce burden on providers overall, but also give them the opportunity to understand and have time to see the links between the two processes.
Thanks, Rich. We also have a few questions about how the 4-year cycle relates to the data that goes into the indicators. So, for example, one question is about, we would only have 3 years worth of the new graduate outcomes survey data. Shouldn't we wait until we have a complete set before we run the TEF? And also the issue about time lag. If we have a 4-year set of data, we'll be publishing outcomes with data that several years older than that. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that relationship.
Yeah, so this isn't necessarily a new issue. It's an issue we had in the previous TEF. I had been intending to say in one of the later sessions a bit more about the scope of the provider's submission, which we see as being a 4-year scope covering the previous 4 years at the point the submission is put in. So if the TEF runs on a 4-yearly cycle, that would mean that providers would always cover every academic year. In terms of the indicators, yes, we do have to make a number of compromises here. We have to deal with lagged data, and the lags are different for different indicators and different for different groups of students. So, for example, part-time students, it takes longer to measure, for example, the continuation outcomes for those students. I mean, I don't want to go into all the details of how that works separately for each indicator, but the indicators effectively cover the last 4 years for which we have data of outcomes for those particular students. So some of the data does go more historically than the 4-year scope described in the submission. Where we have instances where the indicators aren't up to date, or don't cover the period where the last data is available and the submission, then it is, incumbent on the providers, to look at their own information, their own evidence, their own sources within their management information to, put forward a narrative and explain what's happened since that last data, and that will be something that the panel can consider.
Okay, thanks, Rich. We've had a number of questions about educational gain, and could you say a little bit more about what we mean by educational gain and what kind of evidence we would envisage providers could use?
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of things to say here. We have been quite open with educational gain, as I said, in terms of what we think it ought to cover. As I said in my kind of remarks about the proposals, we see that there is a wide diversity in the sector, and we want to know, we want providers to understand their own context and talk about educational gains for their students, for their mix of students and courses. Now, of course, there has been quite a lot of work into related areas around this in the past. So the Higher Education Funding Council for England had quite a big programme of work working with a number of universities and colleges looking at learning gain. And the learning gain work explored things like skills development, personal development, employability, and so forth. And so if colleagues here are looking for ideas of the kind of things that could be incorporated, I would recommend they have a look at some of the outcomes and outputs of that program, and I think we can put a link up to that. Maybe another point to say here is that we do think educational gain needs to link back to teaching and learning. So some questions I've had is, do we see educational gain including things which perhaps aren't related, are more experiential? But I think we do want to draw a boundary around educational gain somewhere. We do want to link it to teaching and learning, but we also recognise that you can have educational gains through a variety of different activities. So I think we'd be quite interested to see what providers say about this in their consultation responses. The last point about the kind of evidence, I think we recognise that for some providers this will be new, and that they may take some time to establish ways of collecting evidence around this. And we've sought to recognise that actually in the way we've articulated the features of educational gain. We're, of course, across this whole exercise, very interested in outcomes for students, but we recognise that it may take time for providers to measure outcomes around educational gains for students. So we are looking more in this iteration of TEF around how well the providers can articulate it, how well they can kind of say they've got processes in place or establishing processes to start measuring it. I anticipate that in future TEF rounds, we will move the balance to be more focused on educational gain outcomes in future. But for this round of TEF, I think we understand that providers are possibly in a setup phase around it.
Thank you, Rich. We've had several questions about the requires improvement category. A number of questions. I think they broadly fall into two types, so I'll try and distill them down into two questions. The first one is really about the choice of language. Why are we proposing to call this requires improvement? Why did we not go with the Pierce recommendation of meets quality requirements? And have we considered the impact this would have on the public or student choice? So that's the sort of first type of question. The second one is around clarifying the relationship between a requires improvement outcome and baseline. Does it mean the provider is above baseline, or does it mean something else?
Yeah. You've asked them as two questions, Graham, but I think they're related. Where to start with this? So I think it's important to say that within the TEF, we're looking to measure excellence above the baseline. I was going to say a bit about this in terms of the scope section next, but perhaps I'll cover it now. So what the TEF isn't seeking to do is to make those regulatory decisions around whether there has been a breach of the baseline. So I think that's quite important to distinguish here. So when we're talking about requires improvement, you know, what we're talking about is that there is improvement required for excellence. There's improvement required to achieve a bronze or higher. In terms of the choice of the language, I've talked quite a bit already about incentive effects that we want to place on providers, and we do think that this choice of language places not only the incentive on providers that may well be in that kind of zone, but also on providers, you know, on bronze and above, to avoid their performance slipping into that area. So we are interested in, you know, whether there are other ways of articulating that, but that still has that kind of clear meaning around requiring improvement for bronze. And I hope that the point I made around clarifying that the TEF isn't making decisions around whether a baseline has been breached or not clarifies why actually we didn't think the independent review language about meets quality requirements is appropriate, because that isn't the decision that the TEF panel was making. So hopefully I've covered various points there.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Rich. There were some other questions coming through that I'll pick up in later sections. So I think for now, let's move on to the next one. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Right. Okay, so our next two proposals cover scope in different ways. So the first is around provider eligibility, and we say that to be eligible to participate in the TEF and to retain a rating once awarded, provider must satisfy baseline quality and standards requirements. So there's a few things going on here that it might just be worth picking out. The first is that the TEF is going to be a periodic exercise, whereas baseline quality and standards is an ongoing, it's something that we regulate on an ongoing basis. So we need to think about how that interacts. So before this next TEF exercise takes place, we would be looking to understand whether providers have satisfied the baseline quality standards requirements, not just in England, but if they're providers in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, also there too. And because we see that the TEF should operate above the baseline, if a provider is in breach of those baseline quality and standards requires, we may well consider that it's not appropriate for them to take part in the exercise. Now, more generally, once a TEF rating has been given, once an outcome has been given to a provider, we need to, on a continual basis, understand whether it's appropriate for the rating to be retained. So there's a number of things that could happen. If the Office for Students investigated and made a decision that there was a breach of baseline quality and standards requirements, we could consider whether it was appropriate for a provider to continue to retain its award. We'd also look to see whether providers are still still have provision that's in scope for the TEF. So just to give an example there, if a provider had a TEF award and then 2 years down the line discontinued all of its undergraduate provision and only had postgraduate provision, because we see TEF as being an undergraduate exercise, we would look to remove the award in that circumstance. And that probably takes us on to the other half of the scope proposals, which is around the courses in scope. So we're proposing that the TEF is an undergraduate exercise. And actually, if we can go on to the next slide, I'll just explain a bit more of that in detail. So yes, we're proposing that TEF is undergraduate, so not a postgraduate exercise. Now, we get quite a lot of questions around scope, actually, and that's the reason why we put just a bit of information on here. So in terms of undergraduate study, what we're looking at is any higher education course that leads to a qualification at undergraduate level. So other undergraduate, first degree, undergraduate, postgraduate components. So we are including things like foundation degrees, HNCs, HNDs, integrated masters, pre-registration medical dentistry degrees. What we're not including though is postgraduate. So, anything level 7 or above. We're also not including level 3 or below, and that includes things like the access to HE courses. We're also excluding what we call postgraduate in time provision. So that's where you have a level 5 or 6 qualification that has a prerequisite for an existing level 5 or 6 qualification as a prerequisite of entry. So, as I say, we get quite a lot of questions about the precise scope, and I would recommend that if you haven't had the opportunity to, you have a look at the data, the indicators, which we've also supplied to everyone. And if you haven't had the chance to look at your indicators, they've been released to accountable officers, so do get in touch with them at your provider to see if you can have access, because that will probably explain, or it'll be easier for you to see which courses are in scope there. Other couple of points to make. The previous TEF covered taught students at providers, and that was the DFE's decision at the time, linking to the greater weight that was placed around student information. We're looking at including registered and taught students in this iteration of TEF, and that aligns with our quality and standards proposals. We're also including all modes of study, so full-time, part-time, and apprenticeships, undergraduate apprenticeships. We're also including international students within the scope of TEF, but it's worth noting that there are some indicators, the progression indicator, where they're not included. And it would be therefore incumbent on the provider through their submission to include information about them. There's a number of courses which aren't included in the TEF indicators. Validated only courses, transnational education, higher education modules, or credit. Now, we're interested in including these longer term in TEF to meet that broader ambition of including all undergraduate provision. At this point in time, though, we're saying that providers can cover these in their submissions if they wish. So if you have your own information and evidence around these types of courses, you can optionally include them in submissions. And there's one more slide, I think, actually, just to bring out in this section, which is around fee limits. So we have quite a few questions around this as well. So you probably are aware that the Higher Education Research Act has provisions within it that mean that if you have the implication is that if you have a TEF rating, you are permitted to charge an inflationary increase on your fee. Now, this table just sets out how that works. And the point I just want to draw out here is that this applies whether or not you have an access and participation plan. So some people have confused this in the past. If you don't have an access and participation plan, you're limited to what we call the basic fee amount. If you do have an access and participation plan, you're enabled to charge up to the higher fee amount. So the basic fee amount is 6,000, the higher fee amount is 9,000. In both cases, if you have a TEF rating, you are allowed to charge a higher rate to include an inflationary uplift, and you can see that on this slide here. Now, I just wanted to link this back to the previous set of proposals because the requires improvement outcome isn't a rating. So the effect of our proposals is that you need to have a bronze or higher to be permitted to charge that higher, the very highest fee amount here. And I should say that there are other fee limits relating to sandwich years and accelerated degrees, and they're available on our website if you want to have a look at those details. Okay, and I'll pause there for questions again.
Thanks, Rich. So we've had some questions around eligibility, essentially the relationship between B3 decisions and TEF eligibility. So one type of question is about the timing. If we are carrying out the TEF periodically every 4 years, what does that mean in terms of the timing of decisions we might make where we find a breach of B3? What then do we do with the TEF award? And second type of question around this is, if there is a breach of B3 for a particular subject or a pocketed provision within a provider, and it might be a much larger provider, does that mean we would automatically suspend the TEF rating?
Yeah. Okay, a few things to pick out here. So I think the first thing to say is the data on B3 will be available and the TEF data will be available. And it may be that providers have pockets of performance which is below the thresholds identified in B3. But it's very important to remember that that is just one part of the decision around B3. So we are looking at context in B3, and there wouldn't be a decision around whether there is a breach of B3 without looking at context. So just because a provider has a pocket of data in a subject that is below a threshold does not automatically mean that there would be an impact on the TEF rating. We would, as the OFS, need to take a considered decision about whether there was a breach, and we would need to take a considered decision about whether that breach was such that it should impact the TEF rating. Now, it's worth saying that normally we think that if there is a breach of any of the quality and standards conditions, that's probably incompatible with holding a TEF award, but we will look at each individual case on its own merits. In terms of the timing, I think the thing possibly to say here is that yes, TEF is a periodic exercise. All of our regulatory monitoring is on an ongoing basis. With B3, colleagues will have seen that there's proposals around prioritization. So we would be working through providers where they've been prioritized because of the information we have about them in our B3 assessments. So we may well get to the point where we've made a decision that there's a breach of B3 subsequent to providing a TEF award. And yes, in that case, as I said, we would look to understand whether or not it was appropriate for the TEF award on rating to remain in place in that circumstance.
Thanks, Rich. On the courses in scope, we've had a number of questions about fairly specific types of courses, professional courses, level 7 integrated masters, as well as some questions about franchised provision, students either taught or registered. I think rather than go through all of those questions now, the best way for anybody to get a very clear answer to those questions is to try to access the data that we've made available to each provider. So each provider has available its own TEF and B3 data that we're proposing through these consultations. If you don't already have access to that, the instructions on it were sent to your head of provider or other accountable officer. So we'd encourage you to go and have a look at that, and that will give you very precise information about what's included in the data or not. So with that, let's move on to the next section.
Thanks, Graham. Okay, so our next set of proposals around the evidence that we want to look at in the TEF, and we've got provider submissions, student submissions, and indicators. And I'll talk through those in turn, but I wanted to make an overarching point around the evidence, which is through all of our proposals, we've very much thought about how to get a good balance between the different types of evidence that are put forward. So in the previous iterations of TEF, and something that the independent review brought out, there was there were criticisms around how data-led the TEF was, and there was kind of data capture. Number of reasons around that, and I'll go into a couple of them. But the really important point to make is that we've really tried to rebalance that through our proposals. So provider submissions, very important. Student submissions, extremely important. And of course, we recognise that indicators are important, but they don't have perhaps the same kind of weight they did in the previous exercise. And in fact, when I talk about the assessment process, we'll kind of mention the fact that we see that there should be equal weighting. There should not be more than indicators should not form more than half the weight of decisions. And I think this is really important to kind of bring out at this point, because we're placing more emphasis on submissions, there's a number of things that we've sought to do to sort of try and ensure that they are robust and really good evidence for the assessment process. So a few things just to say around provider submissions. I mean, hopefully they're relatively familiar to colleagues now. What we want to see is providers drawing on their own evidence, drawing on their own internal information, and drawing on their own analysis of the indicators that the OFS publish to self-evaluate their performance, to understand their strengths and weaknesses, and to put forward a narrative around excellence, and to talk about the strategies and interventions and actions that they take to seek to improve teaching and learning for all of their students. So we very much see this as a real opportunity for providers to put forward their views and their narrative around that. One thing to say in terms of the structure, in the past, there was a page limit of 15 pages for provider submissions. We're proposing that should increase to 20, and that is recognizing that there is more data to look at, and we do have expectations around educational gain, which providers may need to take up a couple of extra pages to respond to. Proposal 8 is around student submissions, and we're really excited to see this proposal in here. So we see student submissions as a real opportunity for students to put their voice directly into the TEF process. Few things to note: there'll be a single student submission for each provider. The scope of the student submission overall will align with the providers too. Across both the provider and student submissions, we'll be seeking to provide guidance, and the guidance will really be to try and provide pointers around how to include good evidence that the panels can take into account. And just trying to think if there's anything else to say about provider and student submissions. Okay, no, I think I'll move on to the indicators. So first thing to say about the indicators is there is a separate consultation document on that, and there's a separate event. So I'm not going to go into a great detail about them, but there are kind of few key things I want to pull out here. Of course, in the past, there have been separate indicators for B3 and TEF. And one of the things that has been a real, we think is a real benefit for providers is that we've sought to kind of bring how we define those indicators together, and so that's more consistent than in the past, and that's one of the reasons we've put that consultation around indicators out at the same time. So a few things to say, and if we could perhaps move on to the next slide. Yep, so in terms of the indicators that we're proposing to use, on the student experience side, we'll have a series of NSS scales feeding into those indicators, teaching on my course assessment and feedback. academic support, learning resources, and student voice. And some colleagues will recognise those as the NSS measures that we used in the subject pilots. On the student outcomes side, we'll have continuation, completion, and progression. The new thing here is completion, where we're proposing in the indicators consultation 2 different approaches actually. And through that consultation, we're very interested to understand the advantages and disadvantages of the 2 measures that we're putting forward. So if you've had a chance to look at the indicators that we've put out in Tableau, when you look at them, you'll see that the indicators are first presented by the different modes, so full-time, part-time, apprenticeship, and for the total undergraduate population. So that kind of lets you see the kind of headline performance. But then the indicators are split, and if we could move on to the next slide. Splits are something we had in the previous exercise, and this is how the splits are broken down for this set of proposals. And the point I wanted to bring out here is how important the splits are actually for the process, because the link there is to equality of opportunity here. So providers will get all of this information, which will allow them to generally understand their strengths and weaknesses, as I've said. But in particular, providers will be able to look at their performance for all the groups of students and subjects within them, and to identify areas for improvement. And the panel itself will also be able to consider how that performance pans out across different groups of students and for different subjects and courses. Okay, so I wanted to make a few points around presentation and interpretation. If we could move to the next slide. I'll explain this slide in a second, but there are a few general points to make first. The first is that we're continuing to use benchmarking to understand how well a provider has performed compared to the performance of similar types of students on similar types of courses in the sector as a whole. That links back to the purpose around looking at the mix of students and courses. And we believe that this remains for the TEF the most effective way of interpreting the data when assessing various degrees of excellence. It's also worth saying what we aren't including in the indicators this time round compared to the previous exercise. So in the previous TEF, we had a process called flagging, where depending on the performance of the indicator, we would effectively assign it a score. And then we would look across all the indicators, tot up that score, and produce something called an initial hypothesis. Now, this was something that was, commented on quite a lot during the independent review process as being something that wasn't particularly nuanced. It made it a really kind of a process within which there was quite a lot of data capture, and there were also some underlying statistical concerns around it. So we've done away with all of that, and our broad intention here is to present data in a much more nuanced fashion. So there aren't kind of cliff edges that were introduced with the previous way that data was interpreted. And we have worked very hard, colleagues in our analytical teams worked very hard on the presentations. We've worked with a metrics peer review group to come up with presentations that we think allow panelists to make much more nuanced decisions and judgments about the performance of a provider in terms of its indicators. So what you can see in this diagram are 4 indicators, and what we're using here is what we call shaded bars to illustrate the level of uncertainty within a provider's performance. So if you look at the top indicator, what this is indicating is that the provider's performance is actually quite close to its benchmark. It's about approximately a half a percentage point below. And we've used that shaded bar to illustrate the range of uncertainty here. So you can see there's quite a narrow bar, and that means that we can be quite confident to interpret that this performance is actually on benchmark. So in other words, the provider students are doing as well as other similar students in the sector. Now, by comparison, if you look at the bottom bar, you can see that, again, performance is quite close to the benchmark. It's just a touch over, but there's much less certainty, statistical certainty, about whether that performance actually represents the underlying performance of the provider. So there's more statistical uncertainty. And providers, when they're looking at their data, would need to think about that. And panelists also, when they're making judgments, would seek to consider that too. And maybe just to pick another one here, if you look at the second indicator down, we can see that the provider's performance is about 4 percentage points below its benchmark. There is a range of uncertainty here, but actually we could be reasonably confident that that is actually performance that is below benchmark. And I think, again, I'll stop there for questions.
Thanks, Rich. We've had a lot of questions coming in around all of this. Conscious of time, we have about 20 minutes left. So what I will do is pick out some of the key questions, and then we'll put up an email address at the end of this. If you have any unanswered questions, you can contact us directly. So we had some about the student submission. Two questions, really. One is, if the student submission is optional, what are the implications if the students don't want to, or for whatever reasons don't? What are the implications for the assessment and for the provider if there isn't a student submission? And then the second sort of related question is about what kind of support will we, or indeed could the provider give to students to help make the submission?
Okay, yeah. So the first point is, yeah, I should have said, apologies, the student submission is optional. Now, in terms of the implication for assessment, if students chose not to put a submission forward, there are actually a number of scenarios that could play out. Now, it could be that the student representatives want to put their information through the provider's submission. So that could be one option there. I would say that where there isn't a student submission, there would be an expectation that the provider would seek to understand why that was, and the provider would have the opportunity in their submission to talk about student voice, but we would recognize that it wasn't as direct information. But in terms of the implications for assessment, my view on it is that it could go either way. So you could have a scenario where there's a student submission included, but it could have implications that meant that the panel decided that it should judge the provider to have lower rating. But similarly, there could be a provider where the submission isn't put forward, where that actually might turn out to be a slightly positive thing if that student submission was going to be extremely negative. So we don't want to presume what the impact would be on the assessment process. What we want to see is that providers have really consciously thought about the student evidence that they want to put in their own submissions, and that they have supported students to pull evidence together in their own student submissions. The panel will have to look across the different sources and weigh up how they relate to each other. They'll have to think about the interactions of that evidence. I'll say a bit more about that in the assessment section. In terms of the level of support, we are going to seek to identify a student representative, a TEF student contact, who would be responsible at each provider for coordinating these submissions. And we would work with them quite closely. We'll put in a package of support with them to help them put those submissions together. We are going to need to understand how we can support providers and students where there isn't perhaps such a history of student representation, and we're particularly interested to engage with providers to understand what we can do around that as well. I think I'll pause there.
Thanks, Rich. So moving on to some of the questions on indicators, that there are a few questions about access to the data, and also a number of questions about actually what people get to see. Will they see the full dashboards, the benchmarks, etc.? So just to clarify that the data we've made available to each provider is the complete data set we're proposing, both for TEF and B3, including the Tableau presentations with the shaded bars, the benchmarks, etc., as well as individual level student data, so you can see what goes into each of the indicators. So in order to access that, the instructions were sent to the head of provider or accountable officer, available via the OFS, and it's available via the OFS portal. So please do try to get hold of that. If you've got any issues, you can email us for support on that. So I'm going to focus more on some of the sort of policy related questions on the data. Firstly, you've talked a little bit about breaking the data down by subject. Can you just say a little bit about how much subject level data will there be? Is it a sort of a complete workbook for every subject as suggested by the Pierce report?
No, we're breaking the data down for subjects as we have with other splits. So you will see all those subjects there. We've broken it down to the CAR2, Common Aggregation Hierarchy 2 level, which I think is about 35 subjects. Yeah.
Some questions about the impact of the pandemic, were particularly on the data, although I guess the question could be more broadly than that. Could you just say a bit about how we're taking account of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I was going to mention this in the final section, actually, on the timeline. You know, we have been considering the ongoing impact of the pandemic and the best timing for the TEF exercise. Ultimately, we think it's in the interest of students to get going on this as soon as possible, and recognizing that there's been quite a big delay since the last TEF exercise. We do feel, though, that there's a number of points to make. We are at the point now where providers ought to understand, to some extent, you know, the impact of how it's affected their provision over these past few years, and should be able to reflect that in their narrative, talk about, you know, changes to teaching and learning that they've made there. In terms of the indicators, we are including year splits. So if there are particular years that have a particular effect from the pandemic, then the provider will be able to see that in their data and will be able to articulate that through their narrative too. We have thought of various different approaches to the pandemic, whether, you know, we should think about different years in different ways, but ultimately, you know, we're treating it neutrally, but putting it kind of on the provider to say, you know, what the impacts have been, and then the panel can consider those narratives on their individual merits.
Okay, thanks. One of the recommendations from the Pierce review was that employment-related indicators should take account of geographic differences in labour markets. So are we taking account of that in any way?
Yes. We have geographic quintiles, which we published a report on before the consultation. I can't remember the exact name of them. Geography of employment quintiles, I think they are. And there's a broader point to make here, which is that we've looked at which benchmarking factors we ought to have for each indicator. But where we've identified that it's appropriate, we have used these geographic quintiles as a benchmarking factor.
Thanks, Rich. And then the last question I'll ask on indicators is about, particularly for indicators based on surveys, if they don't meet the required response rate thresholds, what are the implications of that for both for the data that panel sees and also what the submission then needs to do in response?
Yeah, so we do have to, you know, we have significant responsibilities as an official statistics producer to maintain the integrity of the data, and where there are low response rates, we do have things like suppression strategies in place. And again, where providers have access to data, they'll be able to see where that is the case. I mean, there's a general point here to make about the fact that there will be some providers where they may not have data, whether that's through low response rates, or whether they're a smaller provider, or whether you know, they may be newer. And the consultation talks about a couple of different things. The main one to point out, though, is the fact, as I've mentioned, we are trying to rebalance the submissions and the data overall. So where there is data missing. You know, it's very much incumbent on the provider to make up that evidence within their submission. And we do think that providers that are missing data should have the opportunity and be able to, through their submission, articulate excellence for small groups of students.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Let's move on to the final section.
Okay, I'm aware of time, so not too much to say here. The final sets of proposals are around assessment, and we also have some around outcomes and implementation. In terms of assessment, proposal 10 is that it should be expert review. The independent review pointed out that the panel peer review, expert review is really one of the strengths of the previous TEF exercise, and we've very much carried that forward. So if colleagues look at what we're proposing around the panel, they'll recognise its evolution here on how that's being operated. A couple of points to make. Chris Husbands confirmed as the chair of the panel. So he was so Chris Husbands, Vice Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam, was chair of the previous TEF, so we're in good hands there. We're also proposing that we'll have 2 deputy chairs, one of whom will be a student. And we're also, this is a really important point, we'll be doing everything we can to ensure that the panel is diverse, both in terms of the provision, the experience of different types of provision that the panel has, and in terms of their backgrounds. The assessment itself, we want to see as being very much a principles-based exercise. And if we could just move on to the next slide. We've set out a number of principles around how we want the panel to operate. So I've already talked a lot about how the panel will consider how far a provider delivers excellence for its mix of students and courses. And you'll have seen how what we've been seeking to do is design things like the features, design things like the indicators and how they're interpreted in such a way that the panel can do this. Positive evidence of excellence above baseline requirements should be sought. So it might just be worth pausing on this one. In the previous TEF, the way the data created an initial hypothesis meant that very often we kind of started at this assumption that providers were silver and then looked for kind of positive or negative, and that would move them between silver and gold or silver and bronze. In this iteration of TEF, because we're very much building it above the baseline, we're starting with this assumption that providers have met a high quality baseline. And then what the panel will do is look for evidence of very high quality or outstanding quality across different features. So it's much more of an accumulative process in this iteration of TEF as we propose it. The next point here is that assessment should be balanced based on a balanced consideration of the sources of evidence. And I've made a number of points around how we very much want to ensure that providers' own evidence has a very important role in assessment. But the point I want to make here, and actually this links to the next point about holistic judgment too, is that we don't see the panel making tick box decisions. They're not going to look across the list of features and say, this has been met, and kind of tick it off. What we will ask the panel to do is to look across the range of evidence and come to a considered decision about how that evidence weighs up and whether it relates to a bronze, silver, gold, or requires improvement outcome. The final point here about assessments and outcomes being transparent and coherent. We will publish the panel guidance alongside the submissions guidance so that there is transparency about the process and protocols that the panel will go through. The other point to make here is we've thought quite carefully about the relationship between the overall TEF rating and the aspect ratings, and we do set out a few rules to ensure that the overall rating does have a good relationship. What we're saying is that the overall TEF rating shouldn't go more than one higher than the lowest aspect rating, basically. So to give an example, if you had a provider that was awarded a bronze aspect and a gold aspect, then the panel could decide whether it gave a bronze or silver overall rating, but it couldn't go to gold. The last point I wanted to make about assessment overall is that in this iteration of TEF, we'll have a representations process rather than an appeals process. So once panels have met and come to their provisional decisions about an outcome, we will write to providers and give them an opportunity to make representations about that outcome before we finalize it. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Final few things. We set out some proposals that we want to publish information on our register and how that will relate also to the Discover Uni and UCAS. Transparency is very important here. We also set out that because we will be ensuring that the information is publicly available, providers aren't required to promote their own TEF ratings, but where they choose to do so, we will put some guidelines around it. So, for example, if we have a provider where they have a bronze and a gold aspect and a silver rating overall, we wouldn't want them only to promote the gold aspect rating. We would want them to kind of promote the kind of broader package there. Proposal 14 is that we're suggesting that the scheme should be, the name of the scheme should revert to the Teaching Excellence Framework as it was previously. And the final proposal is around the timings. So I already talked a little bit about the timings earlier, but if we move on to the next slide, final slide here, you can see a bit of a timeline there. We'll run through this consultation process and make decisions. We'll look to appoint a panel. The submission window will open through September and November. We'll carry out assessments through November, March 23. We'll make those provisional decisions and there'll be the opportunity for representations that I just mentioned, and then outcomes will be published in May 2023. I realise I've really skipped over those last few proposals, but I was just aware of time, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So we've had some questions about the panel itself. So firstly, will the panel have people with different types of expertise, for example, as employment expertise, widening participation, or part-time or distance learning, that kind of expertise, or just comprised of academic and student panelists? And I suspect your answer is to question the or in that sentence.
Yeah, well, a couple of points to make. The panel will be comprised of academics and students. Again, that's worked successfully in the past, so we'll be looking to kind of see how we can carry that forward. In terms of the different types of expertise, we'll very much look at different types of provision within the sector. So, we will be considering the different types of provider. When it comes to specific roles, though, like WP experts or employment experts that we've had in the past, we're not proposing to do that this time, actually. We would rather that was more embedded within the experience of individual panelists, and we'll seek to create a recruitment process that facilitates that.
Okay, thanks. And could you just clarify whether all the guidelines that we'll be providing the TEF panel will be made available to providers and everybody making submissions?
Yes, our intention is to we will publish all the guidance that's related to the exercise. So providers, students, panelists.
Okay, thanks, Rich. In terms of the assessment, could you say a little bit more about what we mean by typically, because that's quite a key phrase we use within our ratings criteria?
Yes, so in one of the annexes to the consultation, you'll see that we have more detailed articulations of those ratings. So the slide I put up earlier was kind of the short description. So we say that gold should be typically outstanding. What we recognise though is that, and this is really important, the panel is the expert panel, and they will make they will make judgments around this, and in a number of cases, there will be kind of grey. They'll have to weigh up the different evidence. So we're trying to ensure that there's not a black and white threshold, that there is space for the panel to make reasoned decisions around it. So when we talk about typically, it's to give the panel an element of latitude to operate as experts, rather than just kind of ticking things off. And the ratings criteria talk about there having to be a kind of best fit to the ratings criteria rather than it being this must absolutely match these criteria. And that is something that we have experience of through the previous TEF processes and worked there.
Okay, thanks, Rich. And then a final couple of questions around the timetable. Firstly, could you say anything about when the submission window opens? How much notice will people have about what the guidance is, have their data available, and so on? So when will they get all of that information to be able to start preparing submissions? And then a number of, I guess, comments as much as questions about isn't the timing for submissions tight, and is there any scope to extend that?
Okay, so as you know, what we expect to do, and obviously respondents can comment on this in the consultation, is to open the submission window when we release the specification and the guidance. So that would be, we anticipate that being September, and then the window opening. I anticipate that we'll, be warming providers up to that in advance. We'll need to do things like identify contacts within providers that we can, do some of the more logistical communications with. So it won't just land on people's desks. I think people will know that it's coming. And in terms of the broader point around the overall timeline, as I mentioned before, we do think it's in the best interest of students to get going with this exercise as soon as possible. It has been delayed, and we have to balance a number of things, and promoting and protecting quality is at the heart of what we do, and so we think it is really important to get going on this quite quickly. In terms of the overall submission window, though, yes, we recognise that providers will have to do quite a bit of work around this. We'd hope, though, that if we've pitched this correctly, this should become something that really does align with what providers are doing around their internal process and improvement processes, and would dovetail quite well. But all of what I've described today, all of what I've discussed, we're open to comments on. We're interested to hear views on. So if this does look problematic for individuals or for groups of providers within the sector, then we can think about different mitigations around that if providers put arguments through. So maybe just one point on that to say is that if that is the view that providers have, it would be helpful if they could also articulate what kind of mitigations would be suitable for us to look at the timetable while still achieving our purpose overall.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. And on that note, we have run to the end of time, but thank you very much, everybody, for all of the questions you've sent in. Well aware that we didn't have time to answer them all, but if you feel there's a question that's gone unanswered, please do email them in directly. In the meantime, we actually find the questions really helpful, even if we haven't had a chance to try to answer them. It's really helpful to see what people are thinking about and how you're reacting. But ultimately, we're looking forward to your responses to the consultation. And as Rich has just said, these are all proposals. We're interested in what you have to say about them. So the deadline for responses is the 17th of March. Really look forward to seeing that. And just a final pitch at the end, we also really would welcome the views of students and student representatives. I know a few have attended today, but if we'd also like you to encourage student reps at your institution to sign up to the student listening sessions that we're arranging. That would be really helpful. And with that, the only final thing to say is we're always interested in feedback on these kind of events that we run. So if you haven't already been asked, you can email some feedback to the email address on the slide there. So thank you very much. I hope you found that useful. We certainly did, and look forward to continuing to engage with you as we move forward on the TEF. Thank you very much, and goodbye.